Hey everyone, Cody here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to paint a colorful Colorado landscape with water-mixable oil paint using loose and expressive brushwork. Let's get started. In this demonstration, I will be using Winsor & Newton water-mixable oil paint, which we'll discuss more once we get started. I will be using titanium white, Naples yellow, cadmium orange, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, dioxazine violet, cadmium red, and permanent sap green. And I will be using Rosemary & Company brushes for this demo. Now these brushes are absolutely fantastic. Check the link in the description below. And I will be using a canvas board toned with burnt sienna. And as you can see, I'm just roughly drawing out the scene just to get a general idea of how it's going to look. Moving forward, I have pretty much established the entire scene just using a standard 2B pencil. And I like to be fairly accurate with my drawing because it makes the painting process go much more smoothly. Now some artists like to use a brush to just roughly sketch it out, but I preferably like to use a pencil. And with that, in 20 minutes, the entire drawing is complete, and I can move on into the painting. I begin to mix the sky color using a mixture of ultramarine blue and titanium white until I get an even mixture. I start by laying down the color quite loosely with a large filbert brush, and whenever I do a landscape, I like to work my way from the background into the foreground, because that just helps with working with depth. And I just soften this out with the filbert just to get an even consistency across the entire surface area. Now I begin to mix the colors for the clouds using a mixture of titanium white and Naples yellow. And just to add a little bit of warmth, I use some cadmium orange. I have to be very careful while laying this color down as it is extremely bright against that toned canvas. Typically, whenever I do landscapes, I like to go light to dark when I'm painting clouds and then dark to light whenever I'm painting peaks. I begin to mix the colors for the shadows in the clouds using a mixture of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, titanium white, and Naples yellow until I get an even mixture. I lightly lay this down with a bristled dagger brush. Now, like I said, I'd start talking a little bit more about water-mixable oil paint, and water-mixable oils have pretty much the same properties as regular oil paint. They just have the linseed oil taken out of them, which means you can just wash your brushes in plain water and soap, which makes for a much easier cleanup and the toxicity level is much lower. I've been using these for several years and they have yielded great results. I just start mixing the colors for the shadows in the clouds, and I rub this in using a pointed round. And I always save the darkest and the lightest colors for the very end of the process. And just to wrap these clouds up, I use almost pure titanium white to add some very thick texture. And I save this for the very end of the process. With the clouds now completed, I begin to mix the snow color for the distant mountains, Mount Sneffels, with a mixture of ultramarine blue and titanium white. Then I also want to get in the colors for the highlighted areas in the rock being hit by the sunlight using a mixture of Naples yellow, yellow ochre, and some burnt umber to darken the mixture, and just to add a little bit of warmth to it, I add some cadmium yellow. And then I begin to mix a very dark color using a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and then I put a little bit more titanium white and Naples yellow just to lighten the mixture up a little bit. I start by blocking in the mountain with a small filbert brush using that ultramarine and burnt umber combination. Now, like I said before, I like to go dark to light when I'm doing peaks. That just helps me gauge the tones a little bit better. So if I'm doing a snow-capped peak, I can lay down the darker colors, and then when that darker color is completed, I can just add the snow over the top of it like what I'm doing here with this pointed round. Now, I'm just trying to block this in very loosely just to get a general idea of where the snow is going to be. And I downgrade a little bit and use a smaller pointed round just to get those smaller areas and fine-tune the image just a little bit more. And I just block in this snow field moving towards the foreground a little bit more. Then I start darkening these areas a little bit more with almost pure ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Pretty much a 50-50 mix to get almost a pure black tone. And I don't ever use lamp black because it can kind of flatten the image out a little too much. And so if I use a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, it still comes alive in those shadows. I begin by mixing the colors for the thick forest below with a mixture of ultramarine blue and permanent sap green, and this creates an extremely dark color which is perfect for these shadow areas. I lay this down very loosely with a pointed round brush, and the thing I love about this pointed round is it's just a little too big to create those fine detailed marks, but it's just big enough to block in the area very quickly. And I put in some reflected highlights in the shadows here, and then I began to work on the trees that are being exposed to sunlight with a mixture of permanent sap green, Naples yellow, cadmium yellow, and a little bit of titanium white. And I just bring the tree line up the mountain a little bit more than it was before. There's some colorful foliage growing up the side of the mountain here, which is a mixture of Naples yellow and yellow ochre with a little bit of burnt umber, and I add a little bit of burnt sienna to have a little bit of a rust effect. And in this stage of the painting, things can be pretty abstract, but it takes just a lot of patience and time before things finally start to take shape. And I'm just using a smaller filbert brush to block this in. And while blocking in, you want to use a fairly large brush because you're just trying to get a general idea of how things are going to look. And once you've established all that, you can start moving into the details. I go back to that burnt umber and ultramarine combination mixed with a little bit of water just to have it flow better. Now these little hidden areas I find really fascinating because the viewer almost has to find them. They're not as obvious as the main focal point, and those are the areas I almost put more time and effort into. I start adding the snow patches clinging to the rocks above with a small pointed round brush. This aspect of the painting can be quite tedious as it takes a lot of hand and eye coordination to get it done. I take Naples yellow and heavily water it down because this just helps it flow a little bit better, especially in the block-in stage. Things can appear a little bit flat right now as I've not added the snow patches yet, and the snow patches really add to the shape of the mountain, which is why most of the time whenever I do a landscape, I always like to have snow being a part of the scene. I start getting to work on the mountain right below Mount Sneffels. This peak is going to be absolutely covered in snow, so there's not going to be much rock being exposed here. I take almost pure titanium white and start blocking in the snow field. Probably one of my favorite subjects to paint is snow-capped peaks because they could just capture the light so beautifully. In the beginning stages, it's hard to say where the light is coming from, but once I start adding in the ultramarine and titanium white shadows, it slowly starts to come together. And I want to make sure this shade of blue is just probably a shade darker than the sky because I don't want them to blend together. Start adding the highlighted areas in the rock, just using a mixture of Naples yellow, titanium white, and a little bit of burnt umber. Now this part is quite tricky because I am working wet on wet, which can be quite challenging because the paint does blend together. So I do have to use the paint quite thickly. One thing I do several times throughout a painting, especially a painting that is expressing a lot of light, is I step back several times and I squint. This can help balance out the tones where light and darks meet. So for example, if you were to squint at the image that I'm working on now, it has a bit of a three-dimensional look to it when you squint, but then when you look at it up close, when you're not squinting, it appears quite abstract. Moving ahead a little bit, I have refined the peak quite a bit, and as you can see, I'm letting some of that toned canvas below show through just to add some warmth. And in case any of you are wondering what size canvas I am working on an 18 by 24, and this is my preferred size when working with landscapes. Now I begin to work in the really dark darks on the left side of that peak using mostly burnt umber with a little bit of ultramarine thrown into the mix. And I noticed the blue at the very top of the peak isn't quite strong enough, so I just punch it up by adding a little bit more ultramarine into the mix and less titanium white. This is what I love about this style of painting, is it gives the illusion that it's real if you squint or step back, but once you look at it up close, it could appear quite abstract in some areas. I start knocking out these individual trees growing up the side of the mountain here with a small pointed round brush once again. And this is actually the brush I use for the majority of this painting. And this is probably one of my most favorite brushes to use because it can create such an intricate line and work in those very small details that a filbert or a dagger brush can't. And instead of blocking in the image as a whole before I move into the details, which I sometimes do, I like to completely finish the background before moving into the foreground because this just helps me get a better idea of how it's going to look towards the end of the process. And as you can see, I'm using a small filbert brush to knock out those rocks that are creeping into the tree line below. Well, I decided to break out the palette knife because I thought this snow-capped peak could use a little bit more texture. And I saved this for the very end of the process when I know I won't be going back in later with more detail with a smaller brush. And once I have finished putting in that thick texture with the palette knife, the background peaks are pretty much completed. And now I can begin working on the fall color moving its way into the foreground. Alright, now I begin to mix the colors for the aspen trees in the midground using a mixture of cadmium yellow and cadmium orange with just a little bit of permanent sap green. And I lay this down quite loosely with a small filbert brush just to get a general idea of how the colors are going to be playing out in this scene. And I want to keep my paint fairly thin given that the foreground has an extreme amount of complexity in it, so I just want to keep it nice and loose until I begin laying details over the top of it. And if you're a realist painter and you want to create an engaging and believable scene, you have to focus on three main things, and that is shape, color, and light. Moving forward, I'm just starting to block in that meadow in the immediate foreground with a mixture of cadmium yellow, permanent sap green, and a little bit of titanium white. And I'm kinda all over the place with this painting. In some areas, I'm going right into the details, whilst in some other areas, I like to block it in to get a better idea of how it's going to look towards the end before proceeding. Since I'm just blocking in this area, I want to keep my paint fairly loose, so I just mix it with a little bit of water to dilute it because I want to save that really thick and strong color for the very end. And I think these trees could use a little bit more attention, so I just take a pointed round and just start flicking out the individual branches. I'm starting to slowly refine this area a little bit more with a larger pointed round brush. And I just knock in these shadows in this aspen grove in the background using a mixture of burnt sienna and burnt umber to create a little bit more depth. Working wet on wet can be quite a challenge because you have to go pretty thick with your paint, because if you go too thin, the colors will start mixing with the others underneath it. And I'm starting to use much less water in my mixture and pure paint because as I get into the details, I want to really punch up those colors. And I use a dagger brush to get these details in on the grass in the meadow, and this brush is probably one of my most favorite brushes to use because it is just so versatile in the way you can use it. The thing I really enjoy about painting a scene this complex is it's just limitless of what you can do with it. I love adding these little hidden areas within a landscape, like that river winding its way through the willows, or that hillside being exposed in between the aspen trees. I start getting into the very small details within this landscape, so I use a small pointed round to get these tree trunks in this aspen grove in the distance. And I'm keeping the trees in the background a little looser than the ones in the foreground, because if you actually look at a real landscape, the trees in the far distance are going to appear quite blurry, and the trees in the foreground are going to appear much sharper and refined. I take almost pure cadmium yellow and just start adding these individual leaves on these aspen in the foreground here. And when doing these really strong highlighted areas, I have to make sure the area behind it is much darker so that the foreground really pops. As I'm getting these details in, I'm making sure I'm squinting constantly to make sure my tones and colors are playing out accurately. And I mix sap green, titanium white, and cadmium yellow to add some of these highlights within the pine trees and in the aspen. I've been kind of ignoring this little bush here in the bottom left half of the painting, so I just start punching up the color a little bit with Naples yellow, cadmium yellow, and titanium white. And to add some shadows, I just put in a little bit of burnt sienna. I break out the palette knife once again to add some really interesting grass textures in the immediate foreground. The palette knife could actually be a very versatile tool as well, and what I do is I'll apply the paint quite thickly onto the surface, and then I'll take the very tip of it and drag it through the paint, and that gives the effect of blades of grass. I take that softer green color and start applying it into the background to create a little bit more of the effect of depth. I start to get in these individual blades of grass with the palette knife, and I'm going quite thick with the paint, but in a very controlled manner. And I apply a little bit of cadmium yellow in the grass here so it can kind of work in harmony with the rest of the image. And I add this really thick paint towards the very end of the process when I know I'm not going to be able to go back to it and rework it with a brush. I go back into the aspen using pure cadmium yellow with a palette knife using the same technique to get those areas where the sunlight will be hitting them. And I'm just dabbing the paint around with the palette knife to give the effect of individual leaves within the aspen trees. Now I begin to add the final touches to this landscape, like the really strong highlights and the dark shadows. And once I have finished adding those small details, it's just a matter of signing it, and with that, the painting is complete. I had an absolute blast with this painting, and I'm really happy with the way it came out. It was great to break away from what I've been doing and loosen up my technique a little bit, and I learned so many new things within this painting that I can go and apply to future works. Well, that about wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos just like this one, hit that subscribe button too. And you can find me on my website at codyoldham.com. And also, you can find me on Instagram at Cody Oldham Fine Art. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.